Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. I was supposed to be here last year, and for some personal reasons I couldn't make it, and this was on my book tour bucket list. So I'm delighted to be here. And when I was going to be here last year, the book was only in cloth, published like this. This may be the version you've seen, and it's the version in there. But now, United States, I'm really happy that Naval Institute Press has picked up and has now printed the book in paperback. So it's very exciting for me, and I'm reaching a whole new group of readers because it's a much different group. I'm starting to get some terrific feedback on that. So I'm going to take you through some aspects of Zumwalt today. I made a little note to myself when I hear that the next 8-bell speaker is going to be talking about the court-martial, and certainly there were people who thought Zumwalt might have been court-martialed in the 1973-74 period, when a very difficult period with Nixon and Kissinger and little rebellions on the Kitty Hawk and the Constellation. Certainly there was a cry to relieve him from his job. But I'm going to take you through a more personal portrait today of Zumwalt, and I look forward to your questions as well. And I'm going to begin with some personal things just to clear away the underbrush here. Let me see if technologically I can operate this. It's not working. John. I am pressing the button you told me to press.
Oops.
All right. It's all pictures, but the pictures are worth seeing, except the first few because they're of me. And after that, it really gets good.
It's totally frozen. Okay.
Oh, the whole program is frozen?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll tell you what, as he's figuring that out, let me just take you over the first page of my notes here. But I'll tell you that I just came from Bath, Maine, where yesterday I had, oh, it's working, great, okay, all right. So the best way to understand my book is to begin at the end of Bud's life. I don't know how many of you, if any of you have been there, but I've been there several times. This is where Zumwalt is buried on the grounds of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, on a beautiful hilltop location right next to one of America's most famous, where one of America's most famous astronauts will lie, James Lovell, and Bud is buried there. It's a plot that he chose, and it's just one of the most beautiful and quiet spots in all of Annapolis. And there's only one word was placed on his tombstone when he passed away. Only one word, and that word was reformer. Reformer. We're going to talk about the meaning of that. And then when his wife died, Musetta, several years later, I'll show you some things and talk about Musetta a bit, the words his strength were added. So because Bud Zumwalt was at sea for 14 years of their 53-year marriage, and she endured what hundreds of thousands of Navy spouses and families had to endure of those long separations. And part of his tour, not only as CNO, but before, was to really focus on ways of lessening the burden and lessening the time that and making it easier for families to deal with the long time that their spouses were at sea. So reformer and his strength are really two of the themes of my book. And my involvement with Zumwalt, I'll talk to you about right now. You know, I was at the keeling, I was at the christening. This is a gift from the ship to me. I was very, very proud of that. And just yesterday, I was speaking with the crew of the Zumwalt. It was a big challenge for me because I was asked to instill in the crew a sense of identity for the namesake of the ship that they are going to be sailing on, that will be commissioned in Baltimore, where I'll be in October, and which will be home ported in San Diego beginning in about November or December. And it's only then that it'll be outfitted with its weaponry. So right now they've just undergone their second set of sea trials very successfully, but there's still a lot of work to be done, but it was really a thrill for me yesterday. That's the captain of the ship, not surprisingly, whose name is Captain James T. Kirk. You couldn't make this up, right? So you've got a Star Trek, a Zumwalt new ship, but it's really state-of-the-art stealth. Only 3 of them will ever be made. You all know it's a budget buster already. But the fact is and there's a great debate about whether or not it will be able to meet its expectations and capabilities. I'm siding with the captain who tells me no sweat, but I'm not smart enough, nor do I have the expertise to answer that particular question. That's me in a much younger day when I first met Admiral Zumwalt right here on this is, if you go to C-SPAN, and I went just this morning in my hotel room and took a picture of it and then put it onto my PowerPoint. I was writing a book I was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in the late 1990s, well 1998 to be exact, and I was writing a book, No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam. And that book focused on how the Nixon administration and then the Ford administration, we let an ally, someone who we had promised, the South Vietnamese government, to protect and we would support on April 30th, 1975, which you could argue is one of the darkest days in U.S. history when we let an ally run out of ammunition. This has nothing to do with whether or not we should have been in Vietnam in the first place, which I don't think it was the right war to be in. But once we were in, the way we got out, that was the book that I wrote. When Admiral Zumwalt and I first met a few weeks before this, I told him I was writing this book, and when he heard that it was about Kissinger's involvement, he wanted to know what it was, and I told him. And if you don't know anything about Zumwalt, the one thing that is important to know is that he and Kissinger had a bitter rivalry. They hated each other. It was an extraordinary intensity. And I have a whole chapter in the book on the spy ring, which documents the levels to which Zumwalt, and particularly Zumwalt, had strategically placed his loyal Navy lieutenants into Kissinger's national security shop so that he would be aware of all that Kissinger was negotiating and doing with respect to discussions on SALT, strategic arms limitations, and other issues for when Zumwalt was CNO. Zumwalt knew that Kissinger was going to Paris to meet secretly with Le Duc Tho, the Vietnamese negotiator, before Kissinger knew what day he was going to go. And this spy ring that Zumwalt had developed is one of the great stories, I think, of the book, and I've received a lot of interesting feedback about it. And Zumwalt and I did this interview for Book TV on the subject of Henry Kissinger and the negotiations to end the war. And this is me in Texas Tech, and I want to talk to you about this at the Vietnam Archive for a second. If you haven't read the book, it's important for all of you to know that this book was written. I'm a historian, I'm a scholar. I spent a lot of time collecting my materials, and my sources were the official Navy records that are housed in the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Zumwalt left all of his personal papers to the Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech University. The members of the Zumwalt family who didn't contract with me, didn't ask me to do anything, didn't try to shape this book in any way, when they heard I was writing the book, gave me boxes and boxes of letters that went back 40 years. I had a copy of every single letter that Bud Zumwalt wrote to his father from the Naval Academy during his 3 years at the Naval Academy. 3, not 4, because he was in the war-shortened class that received expedited training. I received probably 50 or 60 of the love letters between he and Musetta all the time they were away at sea. And then all the letters that Zumwalt wrote to his family up through his time as CNO. Every single member of the family were hoarders in the best sense of the word. They kept everything. And when their biographer came, they gave him to me with no strings attached. No strings attached. I also conducted over 100 interviews. I conducted those interviews with people who loved Zumwalt. Almost all of those who loved him were his sailors, particularly those who served with him in Vietnam from '68 to 1970, who filled the pews when he was buried at the Naval Academy, and who would have died for him, and many of them did. And to this day, and it's part of my talk today, I'll tell you why, they view him as their man in Washington, D.C. I also talked to many retired admirals who hated the man for what he did to the Navy with respect to the social change and the change in regulations and the hair codes, the undoing of what they thought discipline. And I talked to equal number of retired admirals who felt that Zumwalt had done a lot, probably a little too much, but if he hadn't have done it, the Navy wouldn't have survived. And then I just was taking a tour here, and I looked over here at this picture right here. And the significance of Admiral Zumwalt is in this picture right here of Admiral Gravely, the first African-American admiral, the first one appointed during Zumwalt's time as CNO. When Zumwalt became CNO in 1970, there were only 3 African-American captains, 3 in rank, only 3. That wasn't by accident. That was because the Navy, and Zumwalt had learned this during his years in tour in Bupers in Washington, D.C., that the Navy had come up with a very creative, ingenious, and clandestine mechanism for making sure that the leadership of the Navy remained white, and that you could channel African-American, talented African-American captains into dead-end opportunities where there would be no opportunity for promotion to admiral. Women, of course, had no opportunity to go to sea at all. Zero, except to work on hospital ships. Could not become aviators, could not get their wings. And Filipinos were consigned mostly, almost exclusively, to steward ranks. And Zumwalt broke it all. But he didn't break it all until he figured out how to do it. And that story is the one in my book. So dozens of interviews, his personal papers, the Agent Orange files, which are so many of them, both in Texas Tech and in Washington, D.C. The Paul Nitze papers in the Library of Congress, because Paul Nitze was his intellectual mentor and taught him the ins and outs of how to think politically. And I'll show you something about that later. The Naval Institute oral histories, probably hundreds of them, conducted by the great Paul Stilwell. Many of you might know Paul. And my research in the National Archives. And with all that information, there's still half of the Zumwalt material unavailable. I was able to triangulate and offer this story. What this story is not it is not a naval history. I'm not a naval historian. Some other person will write that book. Some other person will write that book about Zumwalt and Project 60, which is included here, but about his legacy as a strategic naval officer. This book is a story of leadership. It's a story of it's a portrait of a man. And one of the most honored things that happened to me was, when you need dust jacket blurbs, you don't know what to, you send it out to a lot of people. I had never met former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. I sent him the book and he gave me a dust jacket blurb. And he said if not for Zumwalt, he would have left the Navy. He would have never stayed in the Navy if not for Zumwalt. President Bill Clinton gave me one because Clinton gave Zumwalt the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998 because he never stopped fighting on behalf of his sailors. Those sailors and their children and those unborn who would suffer from cancers related to their exposure to Agent Orange, and Thurgood Marshall Jr., who believed that his legacy, that Zumwalt's legacy in changing the social contract in the Navy was significant enough to endorse the book. So the broad contours of Zumwalt's Zumwalt's life were that he was born. Again, I'll just do this quickly because I want to get to the meat of the matter. He was born in San Francisco in November of 1920. He was given the name Elmo Russell Zumwalt Jr. He hated the name Elmo. Who would like it, really? And his little sister began calling him Buddy, and he went by the moniker Buddy for the first 7 or 8 years of his life, and he changed it to Bud, and he was never called Bud again. And I can relate to that, because I regret it now, but my name and my book, and I published all my books under Larry Berman, and my whole life growing up in the Bronx, New York, I was Larry Berman, but I was born Lawrence Berman. And as soon as I was old enough to hear the name Lawrence, I realized I didn't want people to call me Lawrence. And no one ever called me Lawrence again, ever. Much to my mother's deep chagrin. And because she gave me that name, so she thought it was beautiful. And now only today, as I've got my Medicare card, that I realized, do I regret not publishing under Lawrence? But in my youth, that was the decision that I made. But Bud never regretted that, and he asked everyone to call him Bud. And that's just a small story there. He grew up in Tulare, California, the son of two country doctors. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1942 in the accelerated class, only 3 years, 4 years condensed into 3 so they could go off to war. He received his Bronze Star for bravery in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is covered in the book. I won't cover that today. The family itself now has 4 Bronze Star recipients. 4. It's a family that has honored the code of duty, honor, and sacrifice and service to one's country. He served on destroyers his entire career. He was seasick on every one of those destroyers. He suffered from seasickness his entire life. His first fitness report, the captain wrote that he wishes he could write more, but he rarely saw Zumwalt because he was just over the side all the time. So he was a black shoe, and he was a non-aviator. And when he became CNO, the aviators got it. I mean, that was one of the great battles between the services, because Zumwalt really had the courage, and he had been aching to stand up to the aviators when he controlled the resources, and that's exactly what happened. In 1968, he went to Vietnam, where he changed the whole nature of the war in Vietnam. If he had never become CNO, what he did in the strategic environment in Vietnam between 1968 and 1970, where he changed the war in the Delta, reduced casualties, and put us on the offensive, he would have been heralded just for that alone. But in 1970, he became CNO. He was deep selected over 7 or 8 flag officers with higher rank and more experience. Almost all of them, including Admiral Moore, who Zumwalt would be replacing as CNO, and Moore would become Zumwalt's boss as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Moore kicked his the waste paper basket across the room when he heard that Nixon had selected Zumwalt as CNO, and I'll tell you why he chose him in a minute. But it meant that his Navy career would be over at 54. He was CNO he became CNO at 50 years of age in 1970. It's very young. A Navy career over. Admiral Moore believed that Zumwalt should have gone to the Pacific Fleet first, headed that, and then at 54 or 55 come back and become CNO. But he should have had that command experience. But Nixon selected him because Zumwalt was the only one in all the interviews that occurred. He was the only one of every other admiral had a way to deal with the Soviet Union, had a way to help shrink the budget, shrink ships, etc. Zumwalt was the only one who came in prepared to talk about the personnel problem that the Navy faced. Its re-enlistment rates were at an all-time low behind all other services. African Americans were not signing up anymore, but no one was signing up. Minorities weren't signing up. Women, no one was coming into the Navy. And we were moving to an all-volunteer force, and Nixon understood very well that we had to do something to combat this problem in the Navy. And it wasn't being faced in any of the other services like it was in the Navy. But Zumwalt came in, that's all he talked about. And Zumwalt and Kissinger were blown away by the presentation, and they took him. And that's because for 20 years, Zumwalt had been formulating this agenda in his own mind, thinking that if he was ever in power, it would be personnel policies because of how much time he had spent in Washington watching the personnel system and being horrified by it, that he could change the Navy. In 1974, his term ended. He was only 54 years old. What do? Well, first he ran for the United States Senate in West Virginia. He didn't have a party, for his entire life, so he had to choose a party. Nixon and Kissinger were Republicans, so he chose Democrat. That was the only reason. He was a Scoop Jackson Democrat, a hawk on defense, and a progressive social liberal. a progressive on social issues, but a hawk on military policy. In 1976, he endorsed Jimmy Carter for president. In 1976, he gave the speech defending and presenting the Democratic Defense Platform at the National Convention, Democratic National Convention. And in 1980, he formed Democrats for Reagan, and he broke with Carter, believing that had Carter won a second term, his own grandchildren might not have seen their 10th birthday. And he became a confidant of Reagan until he was deeply disappointed by something Reagan did, which, if I don't forget, I'll tell you. And in 1998, he received the presidential, and then, of course, he wrote his memoir, On Watch, but really the watch never ended for Zumwalt because of what happened in Vietnam and the Agent Orange conflict and the fact that he had issued an order to defoliate the jungles, to reduce casualties, to save his troops, to save his sailors. The terrible irony is that he had issued an order where his own brave son and a namesake, Admiral Zumwalt, a swift boat captain who could have avoided service. Imagine, just like the McCains, in this case, you had a father commanding naval forces in Vietnam and a captain with the same exact name commanding a swift boat in the treacherous waterways of Vietnam. And young Elmo could have gotten out of it in any way possible. But that family, there was no way he would back out. Okay? There was no way he wouldn't serve his country. And it was a test of Elmo's manhood to prove to his father that he could do it. So every night when they went out in the swift boat, he would rip his name off, because if he was ever captured with the name Zumwalt, bad news, right? Because everyone knew who Bud Zumwalt was in Vietnam. Both sides did. Elmo survived, came home, but he had a ticking time bomb in him. And 10 years later, after marrying, having children, becoming a successful lawyer, he learned that he had 2 forms of Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Eventually, he would succumb, but not after a 2-year battle in which Bud Zumwalt and Elmo looked for every possible cure. And in a deathbed pledge to his son, as he held his son just hours before Elmo died, this man who had dedicated his life to honor, duty, and country swore to his son that he would gain accountability and find accountability from those in government who had lied to him when he asked, was this chemical weapon, was this carcinogen, Agent Orange, this, quote, herbicide, dioxin, was it harmful to human beings? And he was guaranteed, no, it's not. And so, Zumwalt had, at this time, when he retired, you don't make a lot of money in the Navy, but he became a wealthy man after the Navy. He was on the board of directors of 17 or 18 different companies and corporations. He was dynamic. He was a great speaker, and the boards loved him. And he gave it all up and worked for $1 a year for Congressman Dernisky, and he was given subpoena power. And he began subpoenaing documents. And eventually he uncovered or discovered a cover-up of massive proportions in the United States government, not by the Pentagon, not by the DOD people, they had never lied to him, but by the chemical companies, Dow and Monsanto, who had tests that showed, and all this is in the book, tests that showed that all of their studies, not just some of their studies, all of their studies had shown that in laboratories, mice and rats and animals that had been exposed to this military-grade weapon, dioxin, cooked at 50 times more than the stuff we use in our yard, that their animals were dying in the labs and that they were giving birth to deformed offspring. And they hid that from the government because they had what was known as company docs. You could always find a doctor who would endorse your story. And so by the time Zumwalt was done fighting for and meeting that pledge that he'd given to his son, and it was in 1998, he was given awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for all he had done on behalf of veterans and their families and their unborn. 17 new illnesses, cancers, for veterans who were in Vietnam and had served in Vietnam, but not just veterans, their children and their children were covered. It went from 3, because President Bush, the first, was the first president to cover these, to 17, and now it's up to 21. And none of it would have happened without Zumwalt. None of it would have happened. So when people think of Zumwalt today, they think of that ship in particular. A lot of people forget about these great debates that occurred during the 70s about whether Zumwalt was undoing military discipline. And think about the whole portrait and the character of the man himself and what he did and how he did it. And as Bill Clinton said, he never stopped fighting for any of those people. And that's why there were at his funeral 2,000 sailors packed into the chapel, and they had driven all over. And I got so many of their names. I went all over the United States to interview them and talk to them. And they would have just died for him. They would have done anything for him, because he never stopped fighting for them. And that's their story. That's what they thought, that he never stopped fighting for them. So I thought it would be fun to do this today. This is one of my favorite photos. It doesn't appear in the book, but it's a sailor putting up a clock, and it says, "It's time for a change." And that's how they viewed him. It's time for a change. Oh, and I want to tell this story. I was flying in yesterday, 2 days ago, to Bath, Maine. And the flight attendant, I'm wearing my DGG 1000 hat, and the flight attendant comes over to me. I'm preparing my notes, going over, and she goes, she asked me a question, and then I asked her if she served under Zumwalt, and she goes, "Yeah, my husband and I both served under Zumwalt. Quote, he made it possible for all of us." Her name is Kiki, and her husband's name is Brian Oppet. She's a United Airlines flight attendant now. I wrote it on my ticket, so first of all, to confirm to you it really happened. But secondly, that I just didn't want to forget it. So he made it possible for all of us. And when I told her about the ship, she said, "Oh, I know about that ship. I've been following it, all that." But she didn't know about my book, so I sold a copy on the plane, which was good. How can you know about my book? You know, but it was a good deal. But she was super. So I told her I was going to take her picture and show it in the PowerPoint. So I did that. And so and here's another example. Many of you probably know this man. Does anyone know who he is? All right. So this is a good story. I just want to pull his bio up right here. Here it is. So this is at the christening, and this man, William Bundy, came over to me. He teaches here as a part-time faculty. He's here quite often. He's a member of the Gravely group. But I just want to read to you. But he came over to me and he coined me with the Gravely coin. And he said to me, "Thank you so much, because we don't need another Navy book about steel and weapons. We need a book about leadership and character and believing in things." And he goes, "If not for him," meaning Zumwalt, "I wouldn't be here today." So I'm just going to read very briefly his bio, which I took off the internet the other day, which is, Dr. Bundy served in the Navy as a career submarine officer. He served as a third African-American naval officer to command a submarine, with the distinction of being the first to advance from the enlisted rank to earn a commission and become a submarine skipper. He is one of the Centennial 7 African-American submarine skippers who served during the first 100 years of the submarine service. Dr. Bundy served in 7 submarines, including attack, nuclear fleet, and missile submarines. I'll stop right there. But when someone like him comes over to me and tells me, like, he gets it, you know, that he wouldn't be where he is today without what Zumwalt did, it makes it meaningful to me. Now, it was time for a change, right? You had a CNO on the cover of Time magazine, and you also had him interviewed in Playboy magazine, right? This is not usual, not very forthcoming. He was known to his sailors as Big Z, which was the first title of my book, which my publisher rejected because he didn't think people would know what it meant. And I guess if Donald Trump can be president, Z for president, right? So anything is possible. On that, you know, obviously he was famous for his Z-grams, which promulgated most of his social agenda. These new hairstyles, obviously, liberalized regulations and practices. And alike, attire, motorcycles on bases, conditions for leave, overnight liberty. It was all overhauled because Zumwalt learned in Vietnam in 1968 to 70 that his sailors had real needs. In 1970, these are a SEAL team in San Diego that Zumwalt's meeting with. When he commanded forces in Vietnam, you know, his sailors would be out there in these hazardous duty. The brown water sailors. This was treacherous work. I'm giving the keynote address at the reunion of the game wardens of Vietnam in October in Mobile, Alabama, and in Huntsville, Alabama, all of these people. It was such treacherous work at this time. And he went out when he became the head of the naval forces. He asked his sailors, "What do you want?" And some of the things they wanted was, we want cold beer, right? We want charcoal so we could cook our food. And Zumwalt started having beer helivaced out to his sailors who would not be on base for over 2, 3, 4 weeks sometimes, and other things. Some of you might find this to be outrageously silly and a danger to have, but Zumwalt thought it was the only way to keep morale up as people were dropping like flies, and they were between 68 and 69. He was definitely a people's-oriented leader, but he couldn't do it alone. That's Bill Norman, who assisted him in so many of the efforts to liberalize naval policy. So let me go to my notes for a second, just so I don't skip this. So Zumwalt was a trailblazer who reformed the Navy, and he was a champion of the men and women who served in the Navy. He forced the Navy to think more deeply and more critically about things that should have been self-evident to them. And by doing so, he became a sailor's admiral, fighting for the rights of what he considered the oppressed, and his nickname was Zorro, given to him by his sailors. I want to read something to you from the book right here. I have it marked. In 1970, he landed on the cover of Time magazine, who called the charismatic Chief of Naval Operations the Navy's most popular leader since World War II. The press quickly dubbed it the Mod Squad Navy, led by its psychedelic admiral. Sailors began sporting longer hair, beards, and sideburns. The infamous Z-grams attempted to meld the traditions of the Navy service with the needs of a nation in turmoil and a culture in transition. The Navy was never the same. Beer dispensers were allowed in enlisted men's barracks. Acid rock blared from service clubs, and women were going to sea. Traditionalists, at that time mostly white retired admirals, ridiculed the reforms as the 3 B's: beer, beards, and broads, deriding Zumwaltism for undoing Navy discipline and leading to mutinies at sea. But that wasn't the view of James Stockdale, former director of the Naval War College, who, during Zumwalt's time as CNO, was rotting away as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam, the Hanoi Hilton. And as was the custom of Stockdale and others, and by the way, Zumwalt only wore one bracelet the entire time of the war, and it was from the day Stockdale was captured to the day he was released. It was Stockdale's bracelet that he wore on his wrist. That's how close they were. They became. Stockdale, as it was his custom, when a new aviator was brought in, a down pilot was brought in and brought to the cell next to him, Stockdale tapped on the wall in SOS. Any news from back home. So hungry was Stockdale for some information back home. And lo and behold, the following message came back. And my source for this is Admiral Stockdale. And it's published in his book as well. Quote, "Yeah, we got a new CNO named Zumwalt. No more Mickey Mouse or chicken shit." Stockdale loved it. Loved it. So my portrait of Zumwalt is of a man who possessed an inspirational faith in the strength of America, its people, and its Navy. Indeed, his entire life was defined by service, leadership, and patriotism. He helped really to shape history. I was drawn to Zumwalt, and I wanted to write this book. I was drawn to his iconoclasm. I couldn't figure out how in the world the Navy hadn't filtered him out. How did he survive? How did he get to 4 stars? How did he rise to this position? How couldn't someone have just somewhere along the line figured out that this man with the courage of a lion was going to shake things up and rattle them? And it's because Zumwalt really played his cards, learned it under Paul Nitze. He played his cards close to the vest. He could have survived in the court of the Medici. He was one of the great internal bureaucratic fighters. He was fearless in taking on Admiral Rickover, and their battles, which are detailed in my book, that date back to his original interview with Rickover, the Rickover interview, all the way through the term as CNO. He never backed down to Rickover, ever, although he realized that he didn't have the bureaucratic resources that Rickover had, and unlike Rickover, Zumwalt was only going to serve 4 years under Nixon, only 4 years. He earned the enmity of his adversaries, but the extraordinary loyalty of so many others. His famous quote on this, you may have heard it, was, "I have a long list of friends and a long list of enemies, and I'm equally proud of both of them." His hostility towards discrimination was equaled only by his hostility towards the Soviet Union. He believed in loyalty down, that was his theory of leadership, and that a commander's obligation is a lifetime to his troops or his sailors, not just a time of their service. And I was drawn to his humanity, the elimination of racial discrimination, the reduction away of family time, women going to sea, the advancement of all minorities in the Navy, and the first African-American admiral. Now, when Zumwalt became CNO, his three predecessors had been aviators. And the person who was replacing him was about to become his boss, Admiral Moore, who would become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He faced formidable challenges as CNO. A Soviet Navy increasing in size and versatility and quality, and confronting the United States on all free world lakes. National priorities were changing. We were leaving Vietnam, and he would be responsible for ACTOV, ACTOV, the accelerated turnover of equipment. What Navy person likes to give over equipment, right? No one. It's painful to turn over your equipment to the Vietnamese and say goodbye, but that's what he was responsible for. And national priorities were changing. The Navy was shrinking. Nixon ordered the size of the Navy to be reduced by ships, to reduce its number of ships, and its budget was significantly cut because national resources were going to go elsewhere. After a decade of burgeoning military spending, it was a period of military reductionism. So the challenge was to fulfill obligations with smaller resources. It was an aging fleet, and something had to be done. And this is where the battles with Rickover started because Zumwalt did not believe that the nuclear fleet was the way to go, the atomic fleet, because of the costs. He endorsed the high-low principle. But the fact of the matter is, the number one crisis facing the Navy, and Nixon instructed him to deal with it first, was retention rates were low, people were leaving, the draft was being called off, the world was in transition, and the Navy was transitioning to an all-volunteer force. How were they going to get anyone to serve in the Navy? And Zumwalt's answer was fun and zest. We'll make it fun, we'll make it zest, we'll get them to sign up. Because if they don't sign up, we'll have no one here. And and the people who are here will be the worst. That was Zumwalt's view. Nixon bought it, Kissinger bought it, and Zumwalt implemented those programs based upon his pledge to the president from his interview with the CNO. So when people think that like Zumwalt went off and did this half-cocked and Nixon wouldn't approve, it's just not true. He told, this is why he was hired to do this. He made it very clear to Nixon in the interview, which is in the book, that he would combat institutionalized racism and sexism. And that's exactly what he did. And I love this quote. I have to go over here to read it because I can barely read it anymore. I had no problem supporting women in combat for 2 reasons. 1, I remember well my grandmother's stories about fighting off the Indians along with her husband as they crossed the plains. And 2, the most vicious and cunning enemy I have ever had to fight was the Viet Cong women. And Zumwalt, there's a long record of this. It's discussed in my book. He found that combating sexism in the Navy was much more difficult than combating racism in the Navy. The Navy rolled over on the racism stuff because they realized that the tides of history were changing. The Navy didn't look like America. It was as simple as that. And Zumwalt's goal was to make it look like America. But everyone dug in. Everyone dug in on women. And the explanations for it are pretty interesting. And in the 10th anniversary of NOW, the National Organization of Women, they nominated Zumwalt as one of the few men in the world who would advance the rights of women, and they recognized him for that. Pretty extraordinary when you think about that came from within the Navy. And here's it's a great quote. I want to share it with you here. So I don't know if you've seen this photo yet. This is Admiral Zumwalt kissing the first Naval Rear Admiral, Admiral Arlene Dirk is her name. I found this, I'm showing this to you because the story is really cute. First I'll read you what Zumwalt had to say. Quote, this is Zumwalt now speaking. Although the Navy was a racist institution, I found it easier to deal with racism than sexism, recalled Zumwalt. It takes longer for a white man to come to believe that a white woman is his equal than it does for him to come to believe that a black man is his equal. That's what Zumwalt said. Quote, indeed, President, this picture is really super. Here it is. Okay. Bud was especially proud of the day that Arlene Dirk was selected as the first female admiral. When a picture of Bud kissing the new rear admiral on the cheek appeared on the front page of all the country's newspapers, Mrs. John Mallett of Garden Grove, California wrote, "First it's booze and rockin' music in the barracks to corrupt the boys. Now it's a kiss for the lib. Are you sure you don't represent the French Navy? No small wonder we can't win the war with the likes of you in charge. May God save America in spite of you." But Zumwalt's response was classic. He wrote back and he often said the following, quote, "But you must understand, one does not become CNO without having to kiss a lot of admirals." Yeah. That's exactly right, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's Senator John Warner, that's the Secretary of Navy, John Warner there, who would then go on, and there's a lot on the relationship between Warner and Zumwalt as well. You know, and the fact of the matter is, the Navy has changed. The Navy has changed, and it's changed for the better. Zumwalt is often described as the man who saved the Navy by bringing it into a new century. There will be 20 other books on Zumwalt. There will be 20 other books on this change of policy. I'm only staking out my position on this. My position is that the Navy is stronger because of what Zumwalt did, because of his social policies. So that's me lecturing at the United States Naval Academy. And when I was at the Naval Academy, I mean, you could really see the effects of the policies 3 decades later. And this is, I just put this in very personal. That is my my first nephew, my mother's sister's son, Jacob, who's graduating this year and heading off from the academy and going off to to Charleston, South Carolina, to be a nuclear submariner. And when I asked him how come he didn't choose Zumwalt as his ship, he said, you know, and he told me the story, and then I looked it up. It was true. Well, I assume it was true. He told it to me, which is that the first graduating senior from the naval class this year who was on the destroyer list chose to service on the Zumwalt. So that person is going to Zumwalt. So Zumwalt was gone by the time Jacob made Jacob's decision. And this is how they. What's that?
Our father, Martin Washington.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. One of my favorite pictures. So there's one other story I want to tell you about the controversy that surrounded Zumwalt, and which is actually I'll tell this first, which is so when he was in Vietnam, his level of compassion for his sailors, he personally delivered over 100 Bronze Stars. His aide would fly with him. They'd go out to the most remote areas because he wanted to be the one to deliver those to deliver the medals. I've got a couple of delayed responses here. That's Admiral Chan, who we worked with in Vietnam on the transition of military equipment between in Vietnam. And here it is. It's going to come up right now. So, but you know, there's a picture before this. Just give me a second. I apologize. Well, there's one. It should be right there. It's like the Zumwalt at stealth. And we'll skip over it. And oh, there it is. So this man is still alive. His name is Admiral Chan, Tran Van Chan. He's in his 90s now, and he was the head of naval forces in Vietnam in 1968 when Zumwalt was in Vietnam. And they forged a brotherhood, a friendship that would endure to the end of Bud Zumwalt's life. They loved each other. After the war, as you know, many of the South Vietnamese leading officers were imprisoned. They weren't sent to re-education camp, they were sent to prison. And in Chan's case, he went to prison for 8 or 9 years, and then he was prohibited from leaving the country for another 10 years. There was one man for 1 decade who kept the fight up to get Chan out of the country, and that was Bud Zumwalt. And Zumwalt used every chit he had, every bit of power he had to get Chan out, and Chan finally got out, and they had a reunion. That picture is taken the moment they saw each other after being separated for 25 years. It was very, very, very moving. And there's Chan paying his respects to Zumwalt with Musa at Bud's grave. My interviews with Admiral Chan, I wish I could write a biography of him. His life is so extraordinary. But the thing about Bud Zumwalt that you all need to know also is that Zumwalt was friends with all naval officers in the South, all of the leading South Vietnamese naval officers. And in the evacuation of Vietnam on April 29th and April 30th of 1975, April 29th and April 30th of 1975, Zumwalt let it be known that anyone would be welcome at his home. And one day, the Wynn family of 13 showed up at his home, knocked on the door. And for the next 9 months, they lived in the basement of his house while the Zumwalts took in that whole family. I've become friends with half that family, very close friends with half that family. They credit the Zumwalts with teaching them to be Americans, for everything from learning how to drive, to coins, to going to school, and the like. And it's just his compassion was extraordinary in that regard. I'm going to skip over some of this because of time. I've told you the Agent Orange story. So the Agent Orange was sprayed in Vietnam. It was Zumwalt's decision. This is Elmo right up there in the upper right, and that's Jim Zumwalt, their surviving son, with their two daughters and his wife Musa. There's the 3 Bronze Star recipients right there. Three of the 4. The 4 is the son of James Zumwalt, who's also his name is James Zumwalt, now running for Congress in Florida, but was a SEAL command, a mine deactivator as a Navy SEAL. And those are 3 Bronze Star recipients: his father, his son Elmo. There's the surviving son Jim, a Marine. And I'm just going to share this with you. There's Elmo, and a few days before he would go into the hospital for the last time, and he wrote his father this letter, and the letter was given to Bud with the instructions, don't open it until I'm gone. And this is what the letter said: how I would have loved to have continued to fight the battles by your side. You always made a difference. You made my last battle, the journey to death, more gentle, more humane. I love you, Elmo. And that led, of course, to the deathbed pledge to find out what had happened with respect to the Agent Orange. And then in 1998, President Clinton awarded in what Admiral Zumwalt described as one of the happiest days of his life, most meaningful days of his life, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And there's Hillary Clinton behind there. He was buried in the Naval Academy, eulogized by Admiral Mullen and Bill Clinton, as well as the Secretary of the Navy. But at Zumwalt's insistence, the Chief Petty Officer of the Navy was instructed to be, at Zumwalt's request, the flag bearer to show his respect for the enlisted men in the Navy, something that's really significant from Zumwalt's perspective. This is the funeral. Elmo and Bill were very close. The relationship between Elmo Zumwalt and Bill Clinton was extraordinarily close. Zumwalt was a private advisor to Clinton, often going in the White House in the evenings, unbeknownst to anyone, to talk to Clinton about issues of war and peace. And there is a Musa at the gravesite. This was furnished to me by the family. Musa herself was an extraordinary woman. I'm just going to show you a picture of them. Married over 53 years. This is them at their 50th wedding anniversary, where he was still running 3 miles a day. She was a great Navy wife, beloved by Navy wives everywhere for what she did. Very active in christenings, as most Navy wives are. She was always his strength. And this is the ship I was on yesterday, although I was not at sea. And that's the slide that I used yesterday, so that's why I didn't switch that one out. I'll just conclude by I want to leave time for questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and I've gone a little too quickly, told you a little too many personal tidbits here and there. But the one thing I thought about, I'll just close, is by telling you that when Admiral Michelle Howard became the first 4-star woman in Navy history, I wasn't the only one to realize that it wouldn't have happened without Bud Zumwalt. He brought the Navy into the 20th century, and as the President said, he was the conscience of the Navy. And I was honored to write this book. If you read the book, you'll find there's a lot of criticism in Zumwalt too. It's all brought in there, but I wanted to give you the broad portrait of his life today. So I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
I just might make a comment.
Or questions or comments, sure.
Well, in 1971, I had 850 men on the little island Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
Building a base comm station there. Of course, we got the traditional messages from Admiral Zumwalt as we completed the comm stay and the runway, which I appreciated. The first plane, Air Force plane, couldn't find the island. The second one didn't. The third one came in, but we were all looking for mail. Usually a month between mail. Zumwalt sent a message apologizing personally that plane did not have the mail and promised the next plane would have the mail for us. And then I realized this guy had a heart. Mail. To him, I was amazed it would be a big thing. He appreciated it though. And we did too.
I have a little section in here about how he got some complaints about the uniform when he was in Vietnam. He got a lot of complaints about the heavy nature of the uniforms people were wearing, and also that they weren't, once they got wet, they really bogged you down. And within about a week or two, they were completely re-outfitted. And the sailors, that was one of the first stories that they told me. So I think there was another hand. So yes, sir.
You said there was an incident with President Reagan.
Yes. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. You know, he was really loyal to Reagan, and so it was the policy of the Reagan administration in the 1980s to do everything possible. And this is well documented. It's documented in my book, and it's part of my next book. it was the policy of the Reagan administration during the 1980s, because of the budget situation, to do everything possible to make sure there was no linkage between not veterans, but anyone's exposure to chemicals and dioxin or anything, and cancers, because of what had happened at Love Canal and elsewhere in the United States. Because if that connection was, or especially in Vietnam, because if that connection was made anywhere legally, that would then open up the United States government to lawsuits everywhere and from a lot of other groups, and it would deplete the budget. And this was documented in a series of emails and primarily between David Stockman, the OMB director, and Ed Meese, the president's attorney general and advisor. Zumwalt didn't know any of this until he got the subpoena power. And when he got the subpoena power and he realized that Reagan, the administration, not Reagan, I'm sure Reagan didn't know any of this, but the administration certainly had taken the position that Vietnam veterans were not to be associated with were not to get benefits because of what it would cost. And that deeply disappointed Zumwalt, terribly so. As a matter of fact, it affected them greatly, and it affected one of the children too, Jim Zumwalt, greatly as well, because one of his mentors was Oliver North as well, and on that. So that's that story. And so it's quite, by the way, it's quite ironic, isn't it, that Bill Clinton, who you wouldn't ordinarily think of this, is actually beloved by veterans for what he did for them with respect to compensation, but it's Reagan who gets all the credit in many ways. It's as a veterans president. It's really interesting. Yes, sir. Yeah. Someone had a question. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I was in the fuel bunkering business, and we used to bunker destroyers in Boston Harbor. And I went aboard one in the Zumwalt era, and the crew would lay out and sit on the deck, their back, the captain and I went along, and he stepped between the legs. And then we got to put the hose aboard. Nobody knew quite where to put it. They didn't open the valves, so we had to determine where the valves were. And that ship was no more competent or able to go into combat, I think, and they were mentioning Admiral Zumwalt rather negatively.
Yeah, fair enough. So the comment was, of course, that there were some of the attitudes that filter down to the way sailors acted on a ship affected overall performance, and I can't argue. That's a fact. The question is, how prevalent was it, and where? Certainly, the tours of duty for the Constellation and the Ticonderoga, where the real things occurred in San Diego in 1972, but their performance at sea was magnificent, really magnificent, and they endured long times away and the like. So, but yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Later on, the admiral in charge of the 1st Naval District boarded the vessel. He got as far as the gangway, and he stood there and looked forward and looked aft, and he told the captain that they are all condemned to the ship or kept aboard for 30 days. He'll come back, and if it isn't any better, there's going to be some court-martials. It was a tough era.
Okay, yeah, it was a tough era. I think there was time for one more. Yeah.
I spent 6 years in the Navy, and the last few years was right here in Newport. And I was on, I guess, the most advanced ASW ship that the Navy had at the time, which was the USS Deploy, just carrying the SQS-26. I heard, well, prior to that, several years prior to that, I had attended an elite school in the Deep South. I met Arnold Toynbee, and I was very much inspired by something that he said. And it's kind of well represented by Thomas Cole's series, Course of Empire. And that's the way I viewed history, and I was fascinated by the process, and I always wanted to know the underlying mechanisms. When I came to Newport, I had an ample opportunity to do so. And I've documented it. I've written an autobiography that's several hundred pages, and a large chunk of it has to do with my observations here. I tried to get involved with the Zumwalt 35. I've met a number of people there, had social interactions with some. There's anecdotal. I'd love to share this with you, because otherwise I would hate to see it just kind of disappear along with the rest of the household effects when I die.
Why don't we talk afterwards, and I'll give you my email.
Question, though,
Yeah.
a separate issue of what I raised my hand initially about was in your book, it described how blood on the Bronze Star. I was very intrigued by that, because he was kind of like in a panic mode as it was approaching Leyte Gulf, and he thought for certain that it would, it would crash. But, and he received the Bronze Star, but then shortly afterwards, in a much, I guess, without fanfare, the CEO, I believe, you said, got a Silver Star?
Right.
He got, right. And I thought about that, and I realized that was a night attack, and they were being followed by radar, and the strategy obviously must have been, and required a lot of, I suspect, a lot of thought and some preparation to do that, because it was the soft mud that saved them. But I suspect what he was doing was hurrying as rapidly as he could until the blip of the ship merged with the blip of the island, and then the Japanese would not know which way he was going to turn or whether he crashed. And I suspect that was the real, event that was taking place. It was waiting for the merger of the blip, the Japanese radar.
So you've read the book, right? So I have a lot of details about how he.
It's not mentioned.
Right, how he back there. I didn't see that, so the only thing I could do, I used that the radar man's first-hand account primarily. That's very detailed. There's a radar man's, I forget his name, account that I used for that very extensively, and then Zumwalt in his autobiography certainly wrote quite a bit about it. And I should have mentioned to everyone, by the way, there is one voice in my book that no one has ever used, and no one will use it again, I don't think, because it's been locked away again, but I had it. Zumwalt, from the earliest time that he began service in the Navy, he went to Annapolis, and he had but he really didn't go to Annapolis to become for a Navy career. He was going to become a doctor like his parents, but it was George Marshall who changed his mind. George C. Marshall, Secretary of State, who was transitioning state to defense, and Marshall told him that the country needed people like him, and so Zumwalt had this choice between service to others as a doctor or service to his country. He chose service to a country and never looked back. But he started something a few years later that he continued all the way till the end of his CNO years, which is he spoke into a tape recorder every night, and just put those tapes away. He didn't know he was going to become CNO, didn't know he was become head of naval operations of Vietnam, but he spoke into this tape recorder every night, impressions of everybody. And then when he wrote his book, Iron Watch, in 1975, he paid someone a lot of money to type up all those transcripts, all of them. And they were given to Zumwalt to write the book. He owned them, obviously. This is before, this is a different era. And so then Zumwalt finished on Watch, and this voluminous set of tapes and transcripts were put into a box and put somewhere where I don't want to tell you where, because I'm not being taped. Anyway, but they were put somewhere and given to somebody, and this box one day just mysteriously was given to me. And so I actually had Zumwalt's voice on these tapes, unedited, on the transcripts, unedited, unfiltered, Zumwalt, like coming back, and if he was pissed off at someone, he said it and said why. But the stuff on Nixon and Kissinger and Admiral Moore and others during this period is so detailed, so descriptive, and so great. Well, I used it all, and so in the book, when Zumwalt speaks, and I cite it as Zumwalt transcripts. And I return those transcripts to their rightful owner. It's a family person, obviously, that's that was really where I got into it with Zumwalt, because I could really feel it. The stuff on the race riots and everything else. Zumwalt spoke to me. He was long dead when I began writing this book, but every night he could speak to me through those transcripts. Now I recognize they were just his voice, and all of us have come home at night, and if we were, imagine speaking into a tape recorder, a lot is dependent upon mood, alcoholic intake, everything. But I filtered my way through it, and it was, I did the best I could with it. So I forgot to mention that, so that's in the book as well. So with that, I think I'm getting the signal. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's a great crowd, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.